Of course, the United States and Israel have accused Iran of working towards a nuclear bomb, and UN inspectors have questioned Iran's claims that its enrichment activities are for peaceful purposes. Well, today, Ahmadinejad said the United States has entrusted itself to the devil and referred to the Israelis as uncivilized Zionists.
Testing new generations of ultra-modern weaponry and the pledge to disclose these armaments on due time is now being used as a new language of threat against nations to coerce them into accepting a new era of hegemony. Continued threat by the uncivilized Zionists to resort to military action against our great nation is a clear example of this bitter reality.
And as I reported, the American delegation boycotted the speech, along with the Israeli delegation, which decided not to hear the Iranian president on Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar. A spokesperson for the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations released a statement and said, over the past couple of days, we've seen Mr. Ahmadinejad once again use his trip to the United Nations not to address the legitimate aspirations of the Iranian people, but to instead spout paranoid theories and repulsive slurs against Israelis. The chief Fox Sports correspondent, Jonathan Hunt, is working the United Nations for us again today. Jonathan, I don't know, he was a little more subdued than last year.
Yeah, given that this was likely his last speech as president of Iran to the United Nations General Assembly, and given the inflammatory rhetoric we have heard from him in interviews all week, a lot of people would have expected a far more fired up President Ahmadinejad to take to the podium here at the General Assembly today. That is not to say he didn't go after his usual targets, Israel and the United States. He once again referred to the government of Israel as, quote, a fake government. As for the US, he said its world domination, as he put it, is at the root of all the world's problems, and it is time, in Mr. Ahmadinejad's view, for a new world order. Listen.
The current abysmal situation of the world and the bitter incidents of history are due mainly to the wrong management of the world and the self-proclaimed centers of power who have entrusted themselves to the devil.
So now President Ahmadinejad will leave the United States for what may well be the last time. He'll do that, by the way, aboard an Iran Air jet, which interestingly has been stored at Joint Base Andrews outside of Washington, D.C. all week, apparently, Shep, for security reasons.
The new Egyptian President Morsi spoke as well, Jonathan.
Yeah, as President Ahmadinejad made his last speech, so the Egyptian president, the new Islamist president, Mohamed Morsi, made his first speech. He picked up the anti-Israeli baton from President Ahmadinejad, saying that Israel should end what he called colonization, occupation and settlement. He also criticized the American free speech laws that allowed that anti-Islamic video to be made here in the United States. But he also completely reflected and echoed a language that we have heard again and again from US officials on Syria, saying the civil war there must end and the regime of Bashar al-Assad must step aside. Listen.
After this regime, the current regime, comes to an end, the regime that kills its people day and night, after this regime comes to an end, the Syrian people will choose with their own free will a regime that represents it and places Syria in its right place among democratic countries.
Now, almost every world leader who has spoken this week has put a focus on the civil war in Syria, but very few of them seem to have any concrete ideas on how to end that civil war right now. Shep.
Jonathan Hunt at the United Nations. As always, Jonathan, thanks very much. Joining us now, the former intelligence officer for the Defense Secretary's office, Mike Barrett. He's currently the CEO at Diligent Innovations, which is a consulting firm down in D.C. Mike, good to see you.
Good afternoon, Shep.
President Morsi of Egypt, he had a little bit for everybody, some condemnation of us, some for the civil war over there, also some words for Iran. What'd you think?
Well, I do think it's important that, we in the West understand this issue about freedom of speech. I mean, this is an important thing, and I think it's going to come back. We saw it with the cartoons a few years ago. This notion that there are things that you just can't do, that we in the West have these freedoms and this sort of post-Enlightenment approach. But that's not the reality on the Arab street. And with Morsi, what we're seeing is a reflection of kind of what that part of the world feels like. And we're going to have to understand and figure out how to deal with that. It's a reality in foreign policy now that we're going to have to deal with post-Arab Spring.
I read a couple of articles, one equating it to fire in a crowded theater, making the argument that at least you can't or shouldn't be able to do something under freedom of speech that is absolutely going to incite violence and death. But whether we ever get to that point is another matter entirely.
Well, that's the issue, right? So, I mean, as much as all of us hate and abhor that which, you know, the Iranian president comes over here and says, right? He is speaking publicly. He's in our country saying these horrible things, you know, that are just terrible and despicable. But we respect his right to say them, and then we have to counter them through, you know, looking at the facts and refuting the statements that he makes, denying the Holocaust, things like that. So, I mean, you know, that is a perfect example of why we believe that free speech has to win out. One of the ironies, of course, about the Egyptian leader is that he and many of the members of his organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, were thrown in prison for decades because they were doing things like political speech. And so you see that, you know, they want to be able to get in power and then to choose exactly which messages come out. That's the real danger of so-called democracy spreading through the Middle East, you know, in an unorganized fashion.
And one of the concerns, I guess, with Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood is that they could have a big impact when the civil war is finally over next door there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the big things we've seen throughout the region is that the Sunnis are taking over in places that were formerly ruled by Shia or by other dictators who are keeping it stable. And that is certainly a big problem. It will put even more pressure on Iran and, of course, you know, Saudi Arabia and the other areas. If we end up in a regional arms race, what happens with Syria being right on the Israeli border? That's going to be a very big issue.
Yeah, it sure is. Mike Barrett live with us in D.C. Mike, always good of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shep.